Hey, it's Matea. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen today. If you've been enjoying Bookends, why don't you give us a follow on your favorite podcast app? This will ultimately help us make more episodes and also connect you with more of your favorite authors. And don't forget to leave a review. It helps us get the word out to others who might enjoy the show. I hope you liked today's episode, and thanks again so much for listening. Hey, and welcome to Bookends. I'm Matea Roach. If you cast your mind back to the summer of 2019, you might think of one of that year's biggest news stories, which was the search for two young men from Vancouver Island. First, they were considered missing, but then they were wanted for the murder of 3 people in northern British Columbia. There was a nationwide manhunt, families left devastated, and a question hanging in the balance, the question of why. What would compel these boys to kill? This isn't an easy question to answer, and there are no easy answers found in Vijay Khurana's new novel, The Passenger Seat. The Passenger Seat draws on aspects of this real-life tragedy, and Vijay weaves a fictional story about high school friends Teddy and Adam. They're not yet men, but no longer boys, and they set off on a road trip in search of freedom and self-discovery. But the further they go, the more lost they become, and eventually they head down a road from which there's really no return. The Passenger Seat examines male friendships and masculinity with nuance and complexity. Author Vijay Khurana is from Sydney, Australia, but he now lives in Berlin, and that's where we reached him for this conversation. Hi, Vijay. Welcome to Bookends.
Hi, Matea. Thank you for having me.
So as I mentioned, your novel partly draws on these real events that happened in 2019 in British Columbia, where there were these 2 young men that committed this series of violent crimes that sparked this nationwide manhunt across essentially the northern reaches of this country. It was a huge story for us here and made headlines, obviously, around the world. It reached you. When did you first hear about it?
I think that I actually first heard about it, or at least it probably sort of entered my consciousness a little while after those events had sort of taken place, a few months later, basically. Obviously, I was sort of, I had the similar reactions to probably what a lot of people had, just sort of a sense of shock, but also a sense of sort of unsurprise as well, because it was sort of the latest in what is a long series of especially young men committing acts of violence. But for me, it also really kind of touched me in a very specific way, because I had been writing a lot of short stories about sort of male friendship and the way that young men kind of move through the world and perform their masculinity and things like that. And so it really kind of struck a note with me for those reasons as well.
What was your kind of engagement with writing about male friendship and masculinity? What was it about that kind of bond that you felt was rich territory for fiction?
I think that as a fiction writer, a lot of what I'm interested in is just something that I don't understand, sort of trying to use fiction to explore things that don't quite seem to make sense to me in the world. And I would definitely not call myself sort of a political writer or a writer who's sort of interested in engaging in political issues. But of course, this topic of sort of male violence is a political issue. But for me, I was trying to get to the bottom of some aspects of masculinity that I saw around me, and even that I saw in myself, and that I remembered from being a young man, years earlier. And especially these ideas of sort of, like the performance of masculinity, the way men sort of see themselves reflected in other men, and the ways in which sort of game playing can come into the way men treat other people in terms of just sort of like psychological games and power dynamics. And basically, I sort of had this fundamental question, which was, I wonder if there's a way to use fiction to not answer the question, but just to explore this question of sort of what kinds of people would be capable of doing something like those two teenagers did. But then also a much more troubling and difficult question, what similarities might there be between those sorts of, inverted commas, terrible men and kind of the rest of us, essentially normal if flawed men?
Yeah, I guess what are some of those received ideas of masculinity that you were exploring? Because I feel like this is a conversation that keeps recurring politically and socially of what are we to do with young men who don't know what they're doing with their lives, who are kind of at loose ends and who have this sort of energy and vigor, but nowhere to put it.
Yeah. I mean, and I really don't want to pretend that, I as someone who's written a novel kind of has all of the answers to these sorts of questions. But I did feel when I was sort of thinking about things to begin with, I did feel that there was a lot of certain kind of narratives that I was receiving sort of through news media, and also some narratives sort of through the fiction I was reading and things like that, that there's often that sense of a kind of a trauma narrative. So for example, something terrible was done to this person in the past and they have now become sort of someone who is capable of doing something terrible themselves, basically. And then the other way of thinking about these things is that idea that these men must just be so monstrous and so beyond our comprehension that we can't sort of possibly hope to kind of understand them or understand their actions. And I sort of wanted to kind of go deeper than either of those two ways of looking at things. And I also didn't want to sort of go down any one particular road, just as you were saying, in terms of sort of young men and sort of what to do with their energies and their interests and their passions or whatever it may be. I didn't sort of want to go down a road that was sort of, I don't know, video games or dark corners of the internet where sort of people talk about masculinity and men in a way that's kind of damaging and unproductive. So it's not one or the other or anything else. But I think the thing that I realized I was really interested in was that idea of the friendship between two men or more than two men, and how that specifically might influence the way the individuals acted.
Yeah, there's all of these kind of drops of information about, self-improvement books, for instance, that are targeted towards young men that people read, podcasts that young men listen to that are specifically targeted to, creating your identity as a young man and harnessing masculine energy and that sort of thing. There's also the world of video games. There's moral panics that have been going back now to the 90s, right?
Exactly.
30 years now on of people being are violent video games making men more violent? And it's no one seems to know really how to talk about it.
Yeah.
I guess I'm curious, what do the bonds between men look like? Because for me, most of my close friends are men. I feel like I have a sort of good read on masculinity, but I'm always an interloper in any situation where there's men.
Yeah.
I don't know what happens when men are alone, because if I'm there, it's fundamentally a different situation, right?
That's a very good question. And I'm not sure I have a very good answer, to be honest. Men aren't a monolith, and we should remember that as we're talking about these things. But I mean, I guess the cliches are, or the stereotypes are, sort of that men need that mediation. They're not good at sitting down together, talking about how they're feeling, what their fears are, what their hopes are, what their dreams are. But you give them sport, or you give them something else, and they can sort of mediate a kind of a communication through talking about something else. And that mediation is something I was also really interested in because of course, a big part of the novel, of The Passenger Seat, is this kind of road trip. And these two young men are sort of sitting basically I always think about this with the campfire. There's this sort of trope we have that it's easy to sort of bare your soul while you're looking at a campfire because you're sort of not looking at the other person. And
you're
kind
all looking at the fire.
Yeah, exactly. And you're sort of all linked by all of your gazes are sort of almost like the spokes of a wheel kind of coming into this central thing. But also there's something interesting there about the windshield, right, as well, because if you're sitting in a car next to someone, you're kind of both facing forwards. You're not necessarily looking at each other. And so I was interested in all sorts of kind of little details, including those little visual details about where are you looking when you're talking to someone and what are you looking at and what are you talking about and things like that.
It's interesting, like there's a specific relationship between like men and masculinity and the car. I feel like the road novel and the road film and guys being on the road is a thing that we can think of so many examples. There's On the Road. My Own Private Idaho is something that I was thinking about a lot actually while I was reading this book.
Oh, yeah.
You know, these stories that have to do with men being in a car and things just going awry while they're on the road.
Yeah. I think I was really trying to sort of avoid just going down the same sort of cliched route of ideas about the road novel or the road narrative and sort of trying to maybe interrogate it a little bit more because I've always found the road trip since I started thinking about this incredibly interesting because it's full of paradoxes. It's full of juxtapositions. It's kind of all about complete freedom. You know, you can go wherever you want. The horizon is out there. There's this wide open space. But at the same time, you're kind of cramped in this suffocating sort of, you know, you're in a vehicle with someone else. It can be boring if you're driving all day. It can be smelly. It can be actually be quite bodily, you know, with two or more people kind of sitting at close quarters together. And it's also one other thing I was really interested in was the idea of sort of young men and the road trip as being it's kind of like a rite of passage or a coming of age. Your road novels are often coming of age stories. You expect to be something different when you get back. And in a lot of, I think, road narratives, basically a child leaves and an adult comes home, basically. But at the same time, it's sort of an abdication of true adult responsibility. So I was definitely really interested in the paradoxes of it. And I think that there is maybe something about that idea of paradox is sort of why it is an important, in so many narratives, an important part of exploring young men and the way they relate to each other.
It's hilarious because everything that you're saying about running away from responsibilities is exactly what I have been so excited about that I have been planning my little road trip that I'm going to do in Morocco. And I think that when this interview goes to air, I might be away on vacation, actually. And exactly, I was like, I want the sense of separation from my day-to-day responsibilities.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this novel, The Passenger Seat, it does draw on real events, but it ultimately is a work of fiction, and it's unfolding in this unnamed region of the Pacific Northwest. But there's enough details that I think for a Canadian reader, you can kind of feel that it's probably like interior BC. Can you talk a bit about imagining that landscape?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the first thing to say is that I have not been to BC.
Really? Oh.
And I'll tell you,
it seems very BC. Yeah, tell me more.
Yeah, I'll tell you what. I in around 2017, 2018, I actually started to write some short stories that were set in a sort of a fictionalized, partly imagined, partly almost mythologized in my own head, west coast of North America. For some reason, it was just a landscape that I was quite interested in, and I also really enjoyed being able to invent a lot. And I read a little, I looked at photographs, but I also just wanted to be able to imagine and to not feel like I had to present a faithful place that was, you know, explicitly being able to be mapped onto a real place. There was a time early on writing the novel where I thought to myself, should this be Australia, where I grew up and where I went on a lot of road trips? Should I sort of move what I've got already? And I realized that I really didn't want to. And I think the reason why was that I felt like actually quite free writing this nondescript North America. And I felt like I didn't want to be tied to my memories of my own experiences too much.
I'm kind of, surprised because it is a very vivid description of something that seems like the BC interior. Not a place that I've really spent that much time. So like, who knows? BC interior listeners, get on the horn, tell us, does it check out? You can be the judge. But it felt to me like this was maybe a space that you'd spend time. So it's interesting that this is like the theater of the mind completely. I want to talk about the two characters specifically, these two teenagers, Adam and Teddy. It's the summer before their final year of high school. They're taking off on this unplanned road trip. They are similar and yet different in so many ways. How did you develop these two guys in parallel?
I think I started out with the desire to portray a friendship first and foremost, more than two individuals. And I thought a lot about my own friendships at that age. I thought about the ways in which sometimes, especially as a younger person, you can be thrown together with someone who isn't all that like you, but there can still often be quite an intensity to your relationship. And I wanted to, from the very beginning, I really wanted to play around with the idea of the passenger seat versus the driver's seat. So asking myself always, who's in control and who's along for the ride, who's being passive and who's being dominant. And I think that Adam is certainly, on the face of it, the more dominant one. He has a clearer sense of his own masculinity, I think, even though it's quite a dark sense, because he, as you mentioned earlier, he sort of reads these books that are sort of, aimed at sort of influencing young men, and he spends time in various corners of the internet. And then Teddy is much more sort of passive. I think he's sort of unclear about what he wants from his own manhood or adulthood. And on the face of it, at least, he seems to be the one who's more along for the ride.
What is the draw for Teddy as this guy who, in a way, is kind of more established? Like, he's the one who has a girlfriend. In many ways, he seems like he's kind of more set up for success. What is the appeal of Adam for Teddy? Like, why do they end up drawn together in this way?
Yeah. Teddy is a sort of pretty handsome kid whose parents are well off enough. He's, by all indications, a fine student. But I think that one thing he gets from Adam is almost a reason or an excuse not to sort of firmly cross the line into manhood or adulthood, because I think he's quite afraid of that. He's afraid of what his relationship with his girlfriend might mean if he began to take it seriously. And he's afraid of where he might be in 5 or 10 years. And I think that for him, being friends with Adam, who quite firmly rejects a lot of what you might call sort of traditional ideas about what a young man might do after high school, it sort of gives him an excuse basically to reject the kind of manhood that's he feels is maybe being offered to him.
There's a lot of kind of approaches to intimacy in this novel as well. Like, we've talked a bit about the confined space of this being a novel, the passenger seat that takes place in a car. You're close together. You're physically, smelling each other's like just body odor. Your thighs maybe are touching. It's almost romantic-like, but it's this relationship between two straight men. What is intimacy and tenderness like between men for you? What did you want to explore with that in this novel?
That was one of the big things I started out with, this question of, if we take that we're talking about straight young men, how does their sexuality influence how they act? And then how is their sense of intimacy affected as well? And how do they behave in intimate situations around one another. And obviously, young straight men very often have a lot of homophobia in them as well. So there's a lot of maybe a push and pull between, wanting to just enjoy companionship with someone, but also a sort of a constant fear about one's own performance of a certain kind of straight identity as well. Again, I don't think that I have specific answers about how young men behave in these ways. And I mean, that's one of the reasons why I know that that fiction is my home rather than something else, because I'm less interested in sort of answering questions than asking them, and I'm more interested in sort of just exploring something without necessarily having to come to a black and white conclusion. I definitely found it extremely interesting to dwell in a really intense way with these two young male characters as they did things like, thought about, when will I have a chance to masturbate? Because I'm in close quarters with this other guy.
I can't do that while this other guy is here, because it becomes gay at a certain point, and we can't have that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that, I really felt like I hadn't read that much in fiction about this kind of thing. So I was kind of quite excited to kind of explore these things. And just, the way all of the aspects of sexuality and intimacy kind of change a friendship.
We've talked about Adam being the guy who's kind of more interested in exploring his own masculinity, is reading books, is listening to podcasts, is the one who can drive. Teddy is the passenger, but also is the one who has the girlfriend, who's more maybe in touch with his sexuality in that respect. And he's also the one who actually tilts the story initially into violence. Why did you want to kind of have it set up that the person who we're maybe thinking is going to be more passive at the beginning of the novel is the person who actually really pushes things over the edge and causes these two boys to go kind of past a point of no return?
It just felt like that's how it was supposed to be while I was writing. But I was thinking, I suppose, about subverting expectations in a certain way, especially because one of my overarching questions was, what is the difference between a monstrous, terrible man and a, scare quotes, supposedly mostly good man? And so I think one of the senses you might get as a reader early on is that Adam is quite a troubling young man and Teddy is not. But I feel as though they're two halves of some kind of whole. And that whole, that friendship was what I was trying to get to the bottom of. And then, of course, the idea that dominance in the novel almost seems to keep switching or keep reframing itself. The question of who is in the passenger seat and who is in the driver's seat sort of keeps sort of changing in different ways. And we start out with these two big parts of each of those characters' identity. One is that one has a gun license and has the money to buy a gun. The other has a truck and has a driver's license. And those are both sort of status symbols among young men. But I sort of wanted to keep playing with that idea of who is passive and who is dominant. And so that's also why it happens, I think.
I want to ask a bit actually about the journey to publication for this book, because The Passenger Seat was just recently published in North America. It's received a lot of praise, but I know that the road to actually finding a publisher was quite difficult. And there were concerns, I guess, about publishing a book that delves into these themes where we're inhabiting the perspective of men who are violent. What was the process like for bringing this book into the world? Because I was really surprised to hear that it was challenging to put this book out. To me, I was just like, this seems very timely and a book that everybody should read.
There was, I sort of heard through my now publisher that there was a publisher who apparently really liked the book but was troubled by the idea of presenting these two characters who do something, very violent, and they basically dehumanize those around them to the greatest extent that is possible. And I just never saw it that way. I don't think I am sympathizing. I think that if you read the novel, you see that there is quite a lot of judgment in the voice of in the narrative voice. I don't think any man in this novel comes off looking good at all. But I think maybe what was quite challenging was that question that I was asking about, what is the difference between these terrible men and the rest of us, basically, and what might the similarities be as well. But I wrote the novel, I finished a draft of the novel quite a while ago, in 2022, I think it was. And at the time, I hadn't had a huge amount of luck sort of trying to get it published, and I wondered if it would ever be published. And then I found the wonderful Biblioasis, and Dan Wells from Biblioasis really, I felt, connected with what I was trying to do with the novel and really understood that key question, that it's a very difficult thing to present in a nuanced, complex way someone who does something so terrible. But maybe it's actually quite important in terms of understanding male violence. I mean, one of the things we tend to hear in the news media is that violence like this is incomprehensible, which that's a very understandable reaction, and it's probably a comforting reaction in some ways. But I'm not sure it's that productive, because if we say something's incomprehensible, we've sort of absolved ourselves of the responsibility to comprehend it. And I think that another thing that I thought a lot about, and in fact, someone said to me before the novel was published, someone sort of said, how are you going to feel if people say, "Oh, you're humanizing these murderers"? And I thought, well, I mean, humanizing is an interesting word, because they are human. I mean, no one's committed a murder who was not a human in the history of this world. And so I think that I am really interested in something about trying to ask difficult questions about masculinity in a way that, I don't know what the effect will be, but my aim is to leave the reader with some sort of difficult unanswered questions. And I'm very grateful to Biblioasis for sort of, understanding what I was trying to do and also believing that it was worthwhile.
This book is coming out at the same time of this Netflix series, Adolescence, which has been hugely discussed, to the point that Keir Starmer in the UK is saying, we as a country need to have a discussion about the things that have been raised in this television show relating to masculinity and violence. Do you think that we are maybe coming to a moment where we're going to be more able to talk about some of these issues? Because I feel as though there's been perhaps a reluctance to kind of look at the fact that, as you say, anybody who commits murder fundamentally is a human, was raised in the same society as the rest of us have been. And it does seem probably important to understand why certain people get pushed over the edge.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I'm not a sociologist, but I do think that we might be coming to a point where understanding people who do really terrible things as products of a very complex culture and society, and also as fundamentally human beings, might be helpful, rather than whether that's morally right or wrong. Whether or not it's a moment, I guess it's not really for me to say, but I do think that there is something interesting to asking ourselves these quite difficult questions. And fiction, of course, is a really useful way to do that, because fiction is all about, it's all about the meditative rather than the calculative. It doesn't come up with concrete answers, but it forces you to sort of dwell in something, in a consciousness, in a situation, in an image, in a period of time. And I guess that's maybe what fiction can add to this discussion, if anything.
Vijay, before we wrap up, I want to actually ask about a friend of yours, because you dedicate this novel to a specific person. You write in the acknowledgements that your conversations with this friend helped shape the story you tell in the passenger seat. Can you tell me a bit about him and how he inspired you?
Yeah, he was a good friend, and he was in fact a friend who had a camper van, and we went on some road trips together. And he was a very generous person, and he was a little bit older than me, about a year older than me. And I think that we, on our travels at various times, sort of staring into the campfire, we did start to think about who we were, including who we were as men. And I wanted to dedicate the book to him because we had more or less fallen out of touch, and he passed away a few years ago, and it was kind of right around the time when I started writing the book. So I did think a lot about him, and I thought back to a lot of those road trips that I took with him and with other people. So I felt that the origins of some of these ideas kind of came from that time. Yeah.
Vijay, thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm glad that friendship was meaningful to you and that those conversations were a part of what led you to write this book. I've so enjoyed digging into all of these ideas with you today.
Thanks, Matea. Thanks for having me. It was great.
That was Vijay Khurana talking about his late friend, Hugh McCready. Vijay's novel is called The Passenger Seat. This episode was produced by Katie Swales. Ailey Yamamoto is our associate producer. Our senior producer is Jacqueline Kirk, and our executive producer is Aaron Balser. Big thank you to our audio tech, Aronde Williams, and to everyone on the CBC Books team. They rock. I couldn't do this without them. I'm Matea Roach, and this is Bookends. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time. Because when the book ends, the conversation begins.